everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. This is Litquake, San Francisco's literary festival, and tonight's event is The Rise of Nancy Pelosi with journalist and biographer Molly Ball and political journalist and analyst Scott Shafer of KQED. I am Jane Ganal. I am the co-founder of Litquake, and this 21st year of our festival, we are all streaming live from the Bay Area to points all around the world through October 24th with 150 authors for your watching pleasure. We know that you are all exhausted by the goings on in Washington, D.C. and around the country. We are too. We actually think that makes Litquake, it gives us maybe a little bit more importance this year in terms of offering connection, humanity, inspiration, and at least a temporary escape and maybe even a few laughs. We want to thank everyone in the literary community who helped put this festival together, including our dozens of community partners, our donors, our board, and even those who bought our Litquake Jeopardy mug. As always, it's an amazing group effort, and we're so grateful. Before I introduce Molly and Scott, a few quick orders of business. Please feel free to ask the participants a question using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We won't be able to get to all of them in the last 15 or 20 minutes of this presentation, but we'll get to a few. I will go through and select some for them to answer. And then after the event, you will be asked to fill out a short survey. These surveys are important to our future fundraising efforts and also just knowing who our audiences are. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. And you can buy Molly's book from your favorite local independent bookstore or find the Litquake bookshelf at bookshop.org. This is a new thing this year. We also ask for your support of Litquake if you're so inclined. We bring you 99% of our events for free. If you believe, as we do, that words and stories have the power to transform what's going on in the world right now, please consider making a donation on Venmo at Litquake, on PayPal at info@Litquake, or on litquake.org. Okay, enough of the politicizing. Let's get on with the politics. Molly Ball is the author of the New York Times bestseller Pelosi. That's the reason we're here tonight, which among its many raves has been called a revealing essential biography by O Magazine. She is the national political correspondent for Time Magazine and has also written for The Atlantic, The New York Times, and The Washington Post. She is the recipient of many awards, including the Gerald R. Ford Prize for Distinguished Reporting, the Toner Prize for Excellence in Political Reporting, the Society of Professional Journalists Sigma Delta Chi Award, and many more. In 2007, I'm not quite sure where to put this fact, she won $100,000 on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. So she pretty much knows everything, I think. Talking to her tonight will be Scott Shafer, whom I've known for 20, maybe 30 years, since he was the the press secretary for Mayor Art Agnos here in San Francisco. He migrated from politics to the government desk at KQED, where he is the senior editor. And he also he hosts the California Report and the weekly show and podcast Political Breakdown. We are very lucky to have them here at Litquake tonight. So please welcome Scott and Molly.
Hey, thank you, Jane. Molly, hello.
Hi.
Nice to see you. I so enjoyed reading your book, and I highly recommend it. And I look forward to chatting with you about some of the great scenes that are in the book and the anecdotes and the takeaways. But I want to begin sort of at the beginning of the book for you, which was when you were inspired to write the book or to begin thinking about the book. You say that the inspiration really began in 2017, and Trump just takes office, and Pelosi's political power is really at an ebb. The Democrats have failed to take back the House, let alone the White House. And you had just taken a job with Time, and you were assigned a profile with her. And you write in the book but I admit I didn't expect to find her particularly compelling. Why was that?
Thank you so much, Scott. I'm so excited to have this conversation and hear what you, as an expert, thought of the book. Yeah, so, as a political writer, the kind of people that you love to profile are the big personalities, right? The Lindsey Grahams and Stacey Abrams and, the politicians who do the soaring oratory or are always telling funny, revealing quips and telling all kinds of fun stories about themselves. And Nancy Pelosi is basically the opposite of that, right? I mean, no matter how much you like Nancy Pelosi, she's just not that kind of politician. So, and she's kind of a tough nut to crack. I think a lot of the book also is about the way that she's perceived, both inside and outside Washington, and the role of perception, particularly for women in politics. And I think that, like a lot of people, I'd sort of internalized this caricature of her that you've seen in, $100 million worth of Republican attack ads, this sort of shrill, quote unquote, San Francisco liberal, the harsh, domineering partisan. And again, as a political writer, you like to write about people who are complex and three-dimensional, and so I just did not necessarily have the right preconception of her, I think. And it was only in talking to her that I began to understand what a remarkable and what an unusual politician she is, because she doesn't do a lot of those outward facing things that we expect, particularly of modern politicians. But everything she does is strategic. And the thing that she is really, really good at, being Speaker of the House, it's a tremendously complicated and specialized and difficult job. So it was a process for me of understanding those specific skills that she has.
Well, and the job of being Speaker, or Minority Leader for that matter, is broken up into lots of little different kinds of jobs. Maybe not so little. And I always thought about Nancy Pelosi, and I've said this a number of times, that the things she does best are the things very few people see. And the things she does worst are the things almost everybody sees, like giving speeches or press conferences or being on Meet the Press. That's not her strength. When that preconceived notion you had of her began to change, do you remember a moment where you thought, maybe something she did impressed you, or she didn't do something you expected she did in a different way? Was there like a light bulb moment or not?
I don't know if it was a particular moment. I do remember, so the first time I interviewed her was January 2018 in Baltimore, her hometown, in Little Italy, where she's from. And we met at a little Italian pastry shop. And she was going to give me a tour of her old neighborhood where she grew up, but it was cold out, and like a true Californian, she does not like the cold. But even though it was 20 degrees in January in Baltimore, she did order chocolate ice cream for breakfast. So that was my first hint that there was something more colorful than the popular image of Nancy Pelosi. But in that first conversation, because we were in her hometown, we talked a lot about her roots, and we talked a lot about her upbringing and her childhood. And one of the things that I really noticed in that conversation was, if you know anything about Nancy Pelosi, it's probably that she comes from a political family, that her father was a congressman and then mayor of Baltimore. And so I think a lot of people have ascribed to him whatever sort of political DNA that she possesses. But from that very first interview, that very first conversation I had with her, she always went out of her way to spotlight her mother and her mother's contributions to her upbringing and to the way that she thought about politics. And I think that this is something that she also writes about in her memoir. She's very frank about it. She doesn't try to sugarcoat the fact that her mother was really limited in what she could do in life, in part by her father. That, her mother wanted to go to law school, wanted to be an auctioneer, wanted to have a business. She even patented a beauty product, but her husband would not let her. And in those days, you needed a man's signature to do something like make an investment. So she seemed very, very conscious of the ways that women's horizons had been limited, And it was clear to me that that had really informed her own approach to life. But also that, she was trying to correct that narrative that had attributed her political career to her father, because when she was growing up, yes, her five brothers absolutely learned politics at daddy's knee, but that wasn't something that anybody thought to teach the youngest, the only girl in the family. And so it was much more her mother's, like many political families, it's really a family operation, right? The politician, the person on the ballot is really just the front person for this whole enterprise. But it was her mother who was really doing the get out the vote work with the Women's Democratic Club that met in the basement. It was her mother who operated the so-called favor file, where constituents would come into that family parlor, and if they needed something from the government, a job, a favor, a spot at the hospital, or on the welfare rolls, it was really her mother who handled all of that work as well. So I think she saw all of the functions that her mother performed in the family and learned a lot. And then also, her mother, I think you can see a lot of Nancy Pelosi's temperament in studying her mother, who was very well known as a tough and tenacious person, somebody you did not want to cross, somebody who told off to their faces both LBJ and Ronald Reagan in time, and once supposedly punched a poll worker in the face who had displeased her. So it's clear that Nancy Pelosi also, I think, comes from a line of aggressive women who don't take a lot of grief.
Well, and her mom's name was Annunziata, I think I pronounce it, which is Italian for Nancy. So she was Little Nancy Pelosi. And her dad, Tommy D'Alessandro, was the mayor of Baltimore, and I think he went on to be in Congress, or her brother was in Congress.
Her father was a congressman when she was born, and then became mayor when she was 7, and then her brother also served one term as mayor of Baltimore later.
And I'm guessing that it was kind of I don't want to say it was like a daily machine, but I'm assuming there was some kind of an operation in Baltimore that that Mr. D'Alessandro, Mayor D'Alessandro, was on top of. What do you think she learned from the way her father did politics?
Yeah, was absolutely every stereotype of sort of the early 20th century, white ethnic democratic machine politics. And it's actually, I think, quite a metaphor for the evolution of the modern Democratic Party, where Nancy Pelosi came from, right? The inner city neighborhoods of Baltimore that were quite tribal and ethnically segregated, to who leads the Democratic Party today, a San Francisco liberal who came of age in California politics. And I think that really does tell you the trajectory of the modern Democratic Party, which Nancy Pelosi has had quite a hand in shaping, right? She was the one, skipping forward a bit, who brought the 1984 convention to San Francisco, which helped create the whole idea of the San Francisco liberal. But to go back to Baltimore, yeah, I think it absolutely was that sort of old-fashioned transactional politics, that politics of sort of factions and party bosses. And it does very much remind you of the House of Representatives, right? There are all these little cliques, and each one has a leader, and they're always feuding and overlapping in different ways. And if you want to lead the entire city, you've got to master all of them and figure out how to play them off of one another and get them all to sort of row in the same direction somehow, rather than being at each other's throats. So I think the factionalism and the transactional nature of that early 20th century urban politics absolutely shaped the type of leader that she is today.
I love the idea of would you say a favor file? Is that what it was that the mom?
That's what they called it. Yeah.
And keeping track of who owes you, basically, that owes you a favor or owes you a vote or something like that.
Right.
She is, of course, identified. She is a San Francisco Democrat. She personifies it, although Kamala Harris may soon do that, even more so. But, she is not, as you write in the book, and she was never a bra burner. She was never a flag burner. She was more of a quiet revolutionary, somebody who, some in the party on the left may have thought, or still think today, that she was maybe too conventional or too moderate. Where did she get that from? Is that just a pragmatism, or is that really who she fundamentally is?
Well, I think it's both. I think, there's an aspect of it that's her personality, and then there's an aspect of it that's probably generational. I mean, this is someone who was born in 1940 and was graduating from college the year that the Feminine Mystique was released, for example. So, and she also, she was literally born into the Democratic Party, right? So her politics was always a partisan politics. It was always a politics that was expressed through the political system, through the system of governance, rather than a sort of issue-based or an activist-driven politics. So in the 60s and 70s, when people are burning bras and burning draft cards and marching on the Democratic Convention, there's a scene in the book where, famously in 1968, there were massive protests outside the Democratic Convention. Nancy Pelosi was inside the convention hall, where her father and brother were voting delegates. So she has always been a part of that Democratic Party establishment. Now, that doesn't mean that she hasn't also been against the establishment at times. For example, when she eventually decided to make a run for House leadership, but she's clearly someone whose political consciousness was always shaped through the party. And so when she did, she was married right out of college and had 5 children in 6 years and moved with her husband to New York City. And so she was always politically active, but it took the form of taking Democratic Party leaflets and putting them under the doors of the other apartments in Midtown Manhattan where they were living at the time. When she moved to San Francisco, it was getting to know the local Democratic Party power brokers, including some in her husband's family. Her husband had a brother who was a San Francisco supervisor, and becoming a part of, again, the party apparatus, being a strategist for politicians, including Jerry Brown, who she helped win Maryland in a presidential primary, and being a fundraiser. She primarily became known in those days as a fundraiser and an operative. And she always saw that being where she belonged. She did not think that she was going to be the person on the ballot, the person out front. She fundamentally saw herself as a behind the scenes operator until the day that she was called upon to run for Congress.
Well, let me ask you about that, because so when she moves to San Francisco with her family, with her husband, Paul, who I guess was from San Francisco, as you said, his brother was on the board of supervisors. And she becomes friends with Phil Burton, who was a congressman and ran the Burton machine in San Francisco, which lived on for many years afterwards. And then Phil dies suddenly of a heart attack in 1983. His wife, Sala, takes that job, takes the seat, and then she dies. Sala Burton dies. And on her deathbed in, I think, 1986, basically anoints Nancy Pelosi and says, you have to run. You have what it takes to run. Had she really not thought about running for office herself? She had been so immersed in that world up until then, but she had never run, and she never really indicated that she was interested in running, at least not publicly.
Yeah, so I was quite skeptical of this as well. The idea that she somehow had no political ambition. Now, she certainly was an ambitious person in terms of she's chair of California Democratic Party. She'd run for chair of the DNC unsuccessfully. So it wasn't the case that she was pretending to be all modest and demure and not to have any aspirations, but she had repeatedly been offered essentially safe political positions, right? Phil Burton, before he died, had basically offered her a safe congressional seat that he had drawn because he was the master of the gerrymander in California, and she didn't, and she turned it down. She didn't want it. She was asked at different points. She was asked to run for mayor of San Francisco, to run even for governor of California. She was the finance chair of the National Democratic Senate Committee in 1986 when they had quite a good cycle. And Senator George Mitchell said, you really ought to run for something. You're really good at this. And she said no to him too. So at the same time, all that time she had young children in the house. So it is certainly possible that was the main reason she didn't run, and not because she just didn't want to run for office. She, at the time that Sala Burton extracted that deathbed promise from her, which honestly I would not have believed if I hadn't spoken to witnesses, because it is such a cinematic scene. But it did happen, and so when that happened, 4 of the 5 Pelosi children had already left home to go to college. And the last one, the youngest, Alexandra, was 17 and starting her senior year in high school. And so Nancy Pelosi went to her oldest daughter and said, Mommy has an opportunity to run for Congress, but if you don't want me to, I won't do it. And Alexandra, who was always the sort of rebel of the family, rolled her eyes and said, Mom, get a life. So it is also possible that she just didn't, unlike a lot of career women today, Nancy Pelosi never did have the experience of raising children and holding down a job at the same time. She had some quite demanding political positions, but they were all essentially volunteer work until she made that run for Congress. But I do think there's quite a bit of evidence that she had opportunities to do it before and she didn't do it. So this narrative that she consistently expresses, and she's a big advocate for women to own their ambition, right? She's someone who is always telling other women that they should run for office. So I don't think she would hide that out of some kind of false modesty if it were the case that she had an aspiration to run.
Yeah. You mentioned that she was in charge of fundraising for the Senate campaign in 1986. And I think one of the things she does better than anybody is raise money. And she, unlike some who sort of kind of discount their fundraising prowess, her office sends out regular updates as like a cumulative amount of money that she's raised. She's up to, I think, over probably close to $900 million now that she has raised since joining the leadership in 2002 in the House. What is it about fundraising? Because some people hate the fundraising, most people, even some elected officials hate to do it. She seems to really love it. Have you seen her make the pitch? Have you seen her close the room, shut the doors and, till people agree to give money? Like, how does she do it?
Well, she is very good at it. I think it probably helps that she's very rich, right? Her husband was quite successful in business from before they moved back to his hometown of San Francisco. So I think being in the sort of social class of the people she's asking for money from certainly helps. But if you think about it, a lot of the skills that politicians use to legislate and to govern are similar to the skills that a fundraiser needs. You've got to basically suck up to a lot of people who think they're really important until you get them to do what you want, whether it's give you money or give you a vote or whatever else it is. But she can be quite persuasive in these settings, and she doesn't waste time. There's one story, I think this actually didn't make it into the book, but a story that George Miller told me, her former congressional colleague who's quite close to her, that she's in a room. It's one of the bad years for the Democrats when they're out of power and donors are starting to get disenchanted and say, well, why am I still giving you money if you never seem to win? And she also has definitely been around the block in terms of being mansplained to by people who think that they know how to do her job better than she does. So she's sitting there listening to some donor drone on about how, well, I'm not giving you any more money until you do X, Y, and Z strategy that I think is right. And she sort of shoots George Miller a look, and she says to the guy, she says, well, I don't want to waste your time. I do think that we may have a couple of seats open up on the Speaker's Council, but I don't want to waste your time. And as they're walking out of the room, the donor stops them and says, "Now, wait a minute, the Speaker's Council, what's that?" And she names, some dollar amount and ends up reeling the guy in. He makes the full pledge. And as they're walking out, George Miller says to her, "The Speaker's Council? I didn't know if there was a Speaker's Council." And she says to him, "Well, there is now."
Exactly. She thinks on her feet or on her heels. So I do want to talk about that first race of hers in 1987, but I want to just bring it back a little closer to the present. As you write in the book, she had been dismissed. She had been vilified. There were people who wanted her job in the caucus. Even after, the midterm elections. I mean, there were people who felt that it was time for a new face. And everything changed, you say, on December 11, 2008, when she is in the White House, having been Speaker-elect, essentially, with Chuck Schumer. And there she is, I think the only woman in the room. And Trump talks about her not really being able to speak, I think, for the whole caucus, and her future was a little shaky. And she stands up And she basically said, Mr. President, please don't characterize the strength I bring to this meeting as the leader of Democrats. And boom. What was it about that meeting, that moment, in addition to her coming out in that rust red coat with the sunglasses, which is on the cover of the book, I should say, there it is. What was it about that moment that just crystallized, what Nancy Pelosi brought to the game?
Yeah, well, Donald Trump has been great for Nancy Pelosi's public image, right? She has really become this sort of icon of the resistance with these memes of her in the coat and the sunglasses. But in that particular moment, I think it was a combination of things that really sort of set the world on fire when she said those words to Donald Trump. It was, first of all, the fact that it was on camera, which was Donald Trump's idea. These meetings, these private negotiations between the president and the congressional leaders aren't usually conducted live on camera, but reality show presidency, there you go. So the fact that everyone could see her say that. And then also, if you think about it, it's December 2018, so it's only been a month since the Democrats have won the midterm elections, the first national elections of the Trump era. And so it's really the first time that Democrats have had any control of the federal government under President Trump. So there were, as evidenced by the results of those 2018 midterm elections, so many liberals and Democrats across the country were just desperate to see somebody stand up to Trump, to see somebody be in that room with Trump who could tell him to his face that I think you are lying, I think you are wrong, I don't agree with you. And particularly women, because the number one political dynamic since the day that Donald Trump was elected in this country has been this overwhelming, unprecedented political mobilization of American women. And so the fact that it was a woman standing up to Trump in particular, I think was very powerful to a lot of those women whose voting and organizing and running for office won that midterm election victory for the Democrats. And then finally, the specific words that she said, right? Not only did she interrupt the president and refuse to let him talk over her, she would not let him tell her where she stood. She was going to be the one to say where she stood in this particular conversation, in this particular interaction. And for so many women who have been talked over in meetings and told where they stand by the man who thinks he's the boss, I think that added a layer of resonance to see this woman, this powerful woman, interrupt Trump and tell him to his face on his own turf, you don't get to tell me where I stand. So the combination of all of those things, and then the content that was produced in that meeting was Donald Trump proudly taking ownership of the potential government shutdown. So that was a political gift to the Democrats that I think she and Chuck Schumer feel that they were successful in extracting. And so she walks out and she's got this little sort of self-satisfied smirk on her face as she puts on the sunglasses and the coat. But one last thing about that image, because people always want to know about Nancy Pelosi's clothes, who does her shopping, who dresses her, that sort of thing. And there is this persistent myth that actually her husband buys her clothes. That is not true, but he does sometimes give her fashion advice. But she obviously has a big closet and a good eye, but she rewears things constantly. So that coat that she was wearing that day was actually the same coat she'd worn to Barack Obama's inauguration in 2013. And when that image became a meme and was on, pillowcases and T-shirts and posters and so on, rather than be excited that people were embracing this image of her, her principal reaction to that was, well, now I can't wear that coat anymore because people are going to think I'm making a statement. And I think this tells you everything you need to know about Nancy Pelosi, in that she's not thinking about her image, she's thinking about strategy and practicality in that moment.
Well, and in that regard, she knows how to size. She sizes everybody up in a meeting, I'm sure, what their strengths are, their weaknesses, what she can, quote unquote, get from them. And she must really think the president is kind of a dope in terms of, because she is sort of the antithesis of him. She's strategic. She has the long vision of what's, she can see over the horizon around the corner. She is not obsessed with her own image. She doesn't really care what people say about her. He's obsessed with that. do you think, does she feel in some sense, I won't say lucky because I'm sure she doesn't want him. She would much rather obviously have had Hillary Clinton be president. But does she see that opportunity to be the foil to Donald Trump? I mean, is she reveling in that now?
I don't think she is. I think she is legitimately vexed by what she believes the president represents, both in his beliefs and in the way that he's governed. That moment, another moment of hers that has become a meme in recent years was when she ripped up the State of the Union address. And there was a lot of speculation about why she did that. Was she trying to overshadow his speech because it was so great and successful? She didn't want anyone to notice. Did she have some ulterior motive? And she is usually a very strategic person, but I don't think that was a strategic act. I think that was pretty much a pure expression of her feelings about Donald Trump, because as you said, he is the opposite in so many ways of the things that she values. And he was in her house at that moment. He'd been invited by the House Speaker to speak on the floor of the House. And what he had done in that speech, putting on these little political stunts, giving Rush Limbaugh the Medal of Freedom and having people stand up and be cheered for in the audience, I think as an institutionalist, as someone who views the House chamber as something of a sacred space, to a really corny but I think authentic degree, she felt that he was defiling the space in that moment. She felt that he was insulting the House and by extension, the American people and our democracy. So I really think that when, she was asked and she said, well, the speech was full of falsehoods, I just couldn't stand it. I think that's actually the truth about what happened. I don't think she planned it going in. She just, in that moment, had to express her. And so I do think that she sees him as sort of beneath contempt, and she tries to think and speak about him as little as possible, precisely for that reason, and also because she believes that politically it's better for the Democrats not to seem obsessed with Trump.
Well, I think it was also in that same speech where she perfected the sort of smirk, clap, where she was kind of like,
that was the prior year's.
Oh, it was the prior year. Okay, see, it all merges together in my mind. But I think in the book, one of her daughters says, "Oh, I recognize that."
That's right. That's right.
And in fact, she has.
The mommy's not mad at you, just disappointed.
Mommy's.
She, according to her children, is very, very good at.
Well, and she uses that, the fact that she was a mom, that she raised, 5 kids when they were 6 years apart from the oldest to the youngest. And she'll say sometimes in a meeting, as you write in the book, do I have to use my mother of 5 voice, So she clearly, she told me in one interview when I talked with her that being a mother really helped her hone the skills that she's using now, with all the multitasking, the temper tantrums and everything else. Do you get that sense? I
think that's absolutely correct. And I think it's something that's been underappreciated about her political style, in part because she is, she's the first woman and still only woman ever to hold that position. And because so much of our political coverage is focused on these sort of masculine tropes. But she talks very frankly about the ways that she feels motherhood prepared her to run a legislative chamber. And it absolutely rings true to me as a mom. She talks about that feeling that you get as a new parent, that your capacities have expanded, right? That you have these reserves of energy and patience and just physical endurance that you didn't even know you were capable of. And she talked, from the first time I interviewed her, she talked about looking back on that feeling and seeing herself completely differently in that moment. And then you talk to her family about how she ran that household, and it was a tight ship. The kids all made their own lunches. They set the table for breakfast as soon as dinner was done. That one of Nancy Pelosi's friends said she knew she had a future in politics when she saw all the children folding their own laundry at a relatively young age. So this is someone who is very good at getting a herd of disagreeable, selfish, tantrum-throwing people all to cooperate in ways that make the family unit function. It is very much like the Democratic caucus. And not to compare politicians to children, but they have a lot in common. And so, and when I think about that, I think about how novel it is for a politician to come in with that skill set, right? How, even male politicians who may have been extremely involved dads, they never had that experience of being, the stay-at-home mom to five kids under 6. So it absolutely shaped her, and I think gave her a lot of the skills that she brings to the table today. And for me, it's some serious mom goals, reading about how she never had, or talking to her kids about how she never really had to yell at anybody because they were all just so terrified of getting that look, that disappointed look, the Catholic guilt look. I've never quite perfected that with my own kids.
Yeah. I want to ask you about one of those, I guess initially a nemesis and maybe still a frenemy, maybe, and I'm talking about AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was one of the squad. She knocks off one of Pelosi's closest allies, Joe Crowley, in a primary, Democratic primary in New York. Crowley didn't take her seriously. Nobody took her seriously. She was 28 years old. And on the one hand, it's a wake-up call for the party. On the other hand, I think Pelosi, my sense is that she was dismissive of it because she only knocked off another Democrat. Don't talk to me till you've knocked off a Republican, basically. So how did she, what is your sense of, how she sized up AOC, in those early days?
So yeah, the night that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez won that shocking upset of Joe Crowley in that primary in 2018, Nancy Pelosi's first call was to Joe Crowley, who was himself a bit of a frenemy. He was a potential threat, someone who was thinking about trying to knock her off as speaker. She calls Joe Crowley and she tells him how devastated she is and how much she's going to miss him. A couple hours later, she calls Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and says, "I am always so excited to have more young progressive women in our caucus. Welcome to the Democratic caucus. Tell me what I can do for you." So she's immediately, wooing this person, trying to make her into an ally. She has been somewhat dismissive of AOC and her ilk at various times. And I think it reflects a couple of things. I think on the one hand, the power that matters to Nancy Pelosi is institutional power. It's hard power. It's the power of counting votes in the House. So if you're a freshman, you're one vote out of 240 Democrats, and your vote doesn't matter any more than anybody else's unless you go out and you get more votes. So so when Nancy Pelosi has dismissed the so-called squad, it's by saying, well, they're 4 votes and that's all they've got. And to her, if you really want to accomplish something in the House, you have to go out and build a coalition for it. You have to get allies. So that comment was, when the Democrats were fighting quite bitterly over funding for border detentions, and the only 4 votes against this very tricky compromise that Nancy Pelosi had negotiated with the various factions in the party, the only 4 votes against it were those members of the squad. So she was being quite literal in that moment. And I think she also doesn't want to be seen as playing favorites in the caucus. She certainly, I'm sure she doesn't think that, the AOCs of the world are a good look for the Democratic Party with swing voters. But she also doesn't want other members of the caucus to feel like she's, favoring this person who happens to have a very large Twitter following over all of the others who also, won their seats fair and square. And as you mentioned, AOC is not one of the so-called majority makers. The Democrats in the House that Nancy Pelosi needs to protect are the ones who are going to lose their seats if they mess up, not the ones whose only threat is going to come in a Democratic primary. So it's a complicated relationship, but I think the fact that I think, having covered the House when the Republicans were in charge and becoming something of a war correspondent covering the Republican Civil War, when the Freedom Caucus was sort of at its height, bedeviling John Boehner and Paul Ryan, they were going out there and telling their constituents or putting in their commercials, the leaders of the Republican Party are morons and we want to get rid of them. You'll notice that none of the progressives who occasionally criticize Nancy Pelosi have actually come out there and criticized her being speaker. She has kept them very much in the tent in that regard. And they're not even a formal caucus. They're just four women who used an Instagram hashtag once. So I do think this reflects a sort of old-fashioned sensibility on Nancy Pelosi's part somewhat, that she doesn't necessarily appreciate the importance of soft power, that having a big Twitter following and a major public megaphone actually is a form of power. The counting votes in the House is not the only kind of power that exists. But I think Nancy Pelosi's perspective on that also was forged by the fact that, when she got her first vote on anything on the San Francisco Library Commission in 1975, that changed everything for her because people had to pay attention to her because she had a vote. As a housewife in 1975, nobody necessarily paid attention when she opened her mouth. Nobody was necessarily going to take her seriously just because she thought she had something to say. It was only because of that hard power, because of having a vote on something, that people took her seriously at all. So I think that it really explains the fact that that's still the only form of power that she really sees as important.
Well, it was interesting too, and I don't know, did you talk to AOC for this book?
I did not.
Did you try? Or
Yes.
I was curious. She wouldn't talk to you?
No, it wasn't. It was more the fact that it was, I was writing this book quite fast and just didn't have time to talk to everybody I would have liked to.
Okay. Well, one of the other members of the squad, Rashida Tlaib, faced a Democratic primary challenge from the city council president of Detroit this past election. And, she's the one who, right after she got elected, said about Trump, we're going to impeach the motherfucker. And I can't say that on the radio, but I can say up here on Zoom, I guess. But Pelosi endorsed her. And, she stuck by her. Was that, do you think, in part to send a message, or was that just real politics? She thought, look, she's going to get reelected. I don't want to alienate her.
It's probably a combination of both. She does protect her members. She does generally stand with her incumbents, especially when they have been loyal to her. It was a little bit more puzzling to me, frankly, when she endorsed Joe Kennedy what's that?
Was that Patrick Kennedy?
No.
Against Markey? Anyway,
Yes,
doesn't matter. Okay.
But yes, Representative Kennedy, she endorsed him against Markey in that Massachusetts Senate primary, which really set a lot of the AOC wing, set a lot of their hair on fire. I think AOC even tweeted about it, because here's someone who has been pounding the drum for, we always side with our incumbents. And she'd used this as an excuse for not backing progressive challengers to some other members. And so it struck a lot of progressives as hypocritical. Now, in this case, it wasn't a House race, so she could say that she was consistent when it came to House races. But her rationale was very interesting. She basically was frank about the fact that it was essentially Camelot nostalgia was her reason for doing that. I do not think Ed Markey ever did anything to get on her bad side. She liked him very much when he was in the House. He drafted the climate bill that she helped push through the House in 2009, which unfortunately never made it through the Senate, but which remains to this day the only major climate legislation ever to pass a House of Congress. So it's not that, she had anything against Ed Markey. She just from the time she was a teenager, revered JFK, actually met him when she was in high school, and her mother, at the time the First Lady of Baltimore, pretended to be sick so that her daughter Nancy could go to this Democratic banquet in her place and sit at the head table and meet then Senator Kennedy. And she attended his inauguration, and she still quotes from that speech all the time, and it was very formative to her ideology. The whole sort of JFK style, and I think also as an American Catholic, it was deeply inspirational for her to see the first Catholic become president. But I really didn't know what to make of that, quite honestly, as a professional Pelosi explainer. Yeah. When she did that, and I really don't think there was anything to it besides what she said there was, which was just that she really likes the Kennedys.
Well, and Markey embraced the Green New Deal, and that's sort of what saved him, isn't it? I think because he got that whole the squad and AOC and everyone sort of got that part of the party to support him. She has been, as you said, very dismissive of AOC. She calls the Green New Deal. At one point, she called it the Green New Dream or something like that. So, she's just like dismissive. She's also been dismissive of Medicare for all, which is something that a lot of Democrats feel very strongly about. And she'll say, well, I've got the signs in my basement. I was for Medicare for all before you were born, that kind of thing. So it does make you wonder. I mean, she is from San Francisco, one of the most liberal parts of the country, but she also refuses to embrace these really liberal policies that, part of her caucus wants. Is that more in tune with her real, true political compass? Like, does she really think, I mean, I know the Affordable Care Act is a big deal for her. It's her proudest accomplishment. But, what is it? Is it that she just is a pragmatic politician? She just doesn't want to embrace losing issues?
Yeah, I think it's primarily an act of political messaging for her. She will say that, in her heart of hearts, she's for single payer. She'd love to see it happen. But she doesn't want to alienate the American electorate. Though we had a conversation about this actually when she was talking before Joe Biden had won the Democratic nomination, and she was talking about how she thought the Democrats needed to run to the center in order to win the presidential election, in order to get particularly those upper Midwest states in the Electoral College. And she said, when you're talking about taking something away from people, referring to private insurance, saying, even if you're telling them that you're going to replace it with something better, people view that as menacing. And I thought that was a really interesting word on her part. But she believes that the voters will feel menaced, the voters that the Democratic Party needs. And at this point, the imperative is to win. She actually did support a single payer bill back in the 90s when Bill and Hillary Clinton's healthcare plan went down in flames in Congress. She was one of a few progressives who backed a single payer proposal at that time. But it is also the case that, Nancy Pelosi is not as liberal as she's popularly portrayed as. In that 1987 campaign, which I believe you recall, she was sort of the conservative Democrat in the race, and she probably won that race with Republican votes. She was running ads in the wealthier neighborhoods of San Francisco, promising not to raise people's income taxes. So, she is absolutely a progressive, particularly on social issues like climate and gay rights. And she would certainly like to see a massive expansion of the welfare state along the lines of the New Deal, which her father supported in Congress back in his day. But she is not as progressive as the AOCs of the world. She does not call herself a socialist. She actually ran against a socialist in that first campaign. What's that?
She's running against another one right now. She's being challenged. Yeah,
it was a little bit of a tougher race, I think, back then. Yeah. We'll see. You never know. But I think, I think she is very much in the sort of liberal center of the Democratic Party. She's been out front of the party on some things, but in some ways the party has come to her, right? Stances that she took that were quite progressive at the time, like being for gay marriage in the 90s and voting against the Defense of Marriage Act and that sort of thing. Those are now solidly mainstream positions in the Democratic Party, but they were once quite liberal positions. So part of it is as the party has become more liberal, she has drifted toward its center.
You mentioned Bill and Hillary Clinton, and there's a little bit in the book about her relationship with Bill, not too much about Hillary, but there was an issue around China, where she felt that Bill Clinton she just felt she couldn't trust him, I think. Can you talk a little bit about how she felt about the Clintons? Because in 2008, she did not endorse Hillary in the primary. I think a lot of people had the sense that she preferred Barack Obama. She never said that, but certainly, that was my impression. How do you think she views the Clintons? And obviously, I'm sure she views them each differently, but what's your take on that?
Yeah, there's a little bit of distance there. They're sort of parallel political worlds that don't really intersect, which is kind of unusual given the lofty circles that they're both playing in Democratic politics. But there was a lot of friction during the Clinton administration when Bill Clinton made a promise to her and then broke it, and she never forgave him. And she was quite harsh in her criticism of him. She, starting with Tiananmen Square in 1989, she became very active on the issue of human rights in China. It actually sort of made her political reputation at a time when she was sort of a junior backbencher from a safe district, who no one was sure whether to take seriously. And one of my favorite stories in the book was the time in 1991 when she and a couple of other members actually went to China, snuck away from their Chinese government handlers, and went to Tiananmen Square and unfurled a protest banner to memorialize the protesters who died. And they were chased out of Tiananmen Square by the Chinese police, who actually beat up a couple of the correspondents who were there to cover this. That was a pretty ballsy thing to do, and pretty confrontational. But at the same time, she was working in Congress to form alliances and advance legislation, and got in the face of George H.W. Bush. And then, so what she really wanted, what a lot of human rights activists wanted, was for trade with China to be conditioned on some kind of human rights benchmark, some kind of progress on human rights. And Bill Clinton promised her that he would do this. And when he got into office, he did do it, but he was then pressured by particularly the business community, which did not want to lose these billions of dollars in trade. He came under heavy pressure to reverse that, and he did. Yeah. And so she never forgave him for this. She was scathingly critical of him in her public comments. She basically accused him of, selling out Chinese dissidents for money. And so the relations were a little bit chilly there for some years. Now, she and Hillary have become much more friendly. But, I think also that both the Clintons and the Pelosis have long memories for grudges. So the tiniest slight, I think is a characteristic of both of these political families, that the tiniest slight will be remembered for a very long time. So there's just a lot of water under that particular bridge. But I have heard that since 2016, she and Hillary have become quite close, particularly as they've commiserated on the topic of Russia and what has happened with Trump.
Yeah. I see Jane Goodall there, which makes me think.
I'm sorry to bust into this fascinating conversation, but I just wanted to remind people that they can ask a question. If you click the little Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, write a question in, and I'll kind of be monitoring that for the last 20 minutes or so here. And I had one of my own, which was that I've been thinking about the speaker in the last couple of weeks since, it became evident that Trump was maybe a lot sicker than anybody was letting on, and that meant if Pence were to get sick and be incapacitated, then it would be Nancy, right, who was acting president of the United States. And I wonder if you talked to her at all during that time to find out if she really thought that was something that might happen and what she was doing to prepare for it.
No, I have not spoken to her in the last couple of weeks, which is when this situation has been operative. But it has been interesting to see, for a while there was a President Pelosi hashtag trending on Twitter earlier this year. There's a bar in DC that has a glass case on the wall that says, "In case of President Pelosi, break glass," and inside there's a bottle of champagne. So there are a lot of people on the left who are quite aware of the presidential line of succession and where she figures into it. I don't know. It's a very interesting question, actually, whether she has made any concrete plans for how she would assume those duties. I'm guessing she has enough other stuff to do. But look, I mean, she and the Congress have been very involved in shaping the federal response to the coronavirus. She's been very critical of the Trump administration and the way that it's handled pretty much everything. And she and the Treasury Secretary, Steven Mnuchin, were the principal architects of those multi-trillion-dollar relief packages that were passed earlier in the year. And in fact, I describe in the book her skills as a negotiator, and the way that even as minority leader during the Trump presidency, she's been able to negotiate and maneuver her way to a series of quite good deals for the Democrats, including that government shutdown that Trump just folded and caved and basically gave her what she wanted. And so part of the reason that she liked negotiating with Mnuchin was that she could sort of get the better of him. And Republicans finally noticed this, and now they won't let him negotiate with her anymore, which is a big part of the reason why there hasn't been another coronavirus relief legislative package. But all that is to say, she's been there on the front lines of trying to get things done. And to me, it has a lot of echoes of 2008, when she's the speaker. There's a Republican president that she believes is some combination of, dangerously incompetent and not too bright. But the country is in crisis, and somebody's got to do something. And there were a lot of Democrats saying, well, why should we bail out Wall Street, number one? And number two, why should we help President George W. Bush when it's his economy that's in free fall, when he made this happen and he should pay the price? And she simply, it probably would have been to her political benefit to walk away and not do anything, but she felt a responsibility to act and to get something done. And I think that that's the same approach she's taken this year, that, she drives a hard bargain. She's not going to take just any deal that if she believes that, that her leverage has not been maximized. But she absolutely believes that it's the government's job to govern, and they've got to do something to help people, even if that ends up redounding to the political benefit of a president that she's not particularly fond of.
Jane, go ahead. Do you have a question?
Well, no, there's now suddenly 5 questions in the queue. So actually 6 as we speak. Scott, you can either, throw these out or I can.
Oh, I have to look at them, don't I? There we go. Okay.
The one, Francis Dinkelspiel asks, what is she doing behind the scenes to defeat Trump? She was so successful in getting Democratic votes in 2018. Is she doing that again? And is she much smarter than Trump, which I think you may have already kind of addressed.
On the question of politics, she absolutely has been, as we've talked about before, she's raising buckets of money, which is pretty easy for Democrats this year. It hasn't always been easy in the past, but there's just a tremendous level of energy and motivation on the grassroots left. So that obviously makes her job easier where fundraising is concerned. And she is working hand in glove with the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Whoever the chair of that committee is at any given time basically lives in her office, and they talk constantly. She has an encyclopedic command of the congressional map. She can tell you every district that's in play. She'll sort of move down the map. She'll start in the northeast corner and go south and then move westward, and she can, previous campaign committee chairs, Rahm Emanuel and Steve Israel, have told me it's downright frightening the way she can, she's memorized basically the file on each of these races and wants to know where every one of these candidates stands. So she's involved with all of it. She's out there recruiting candidates, trying to convince people to run for office. Again, this is easier in the Trump era than it was in a lot of years in the past, when Democrats had more trouble convincing people to get out there, particularly when it comes to women candidates. And she's involved in the messaging and strategy on a very high level as well. You remember, in 2006, when she and Rahm Emanuel were working to win back the House for the Democrats for the first time since the Gingrich Revolution in '94. At that time, the strategy was very much about just beating up on George W. Bush and making him take the blame for the Iraq War and making the public see how badly the war was going. And they did eventually put out a sort of nominal policy agenda, the 6 for 06, but it was all sort of small bore, poll tested, stuff that wasn't going to piss anybody off, like raising the minimum wage. So that was a campaign that was very much about the incumbent president, rather than being about the Democratic vision for the future. In 2018, she she believed that the right strategy was the opposite of that, right? That the Democrats had to lay off the incumbent as much as possible, in part because they were running for congressional seats in districts that kind of like Trump, and in part because Trump already takes up the entire political airspace. And she felt that what people wanted to be assured of in order to vote for a Democrat was that Democrats actually were running on something besides just being against Trump. And so she was hammering home to her candidates every single day, go out there and talk about healthcare, go out there and talk about cleaning up the campaign finance system, go out there and talk about jobs and wages and cleaner government. But try not to talk about Trump at all if you can help it. And I think it is possible that none of this matters, that they're all, political science fundamentals at work. And so these strategies really don't make a difference. But to the extent that anything can be attributed to a political strategy, I think she really does believe that that was a successful strategy in 2018. And it's a successful strategy for 2020 as well, that everyone from Joe Biden on down needs to be convincing the American people that they have a vision to improve their lives in a concrete way, better jobs, better healthcare, cleaner government, and that they're not just obsessed with Trump.
One thing we haven't really talked about is impeachment. And, there was a real cry from the left wing of the party, and her good friend Tom Steyer spent millions of dollars on TV ads talking about the need to impeach the president. And she held firm, and she wouldn't go there until a small group of these security and national defense Democrats, Abigail Spanberger, former CIA agent, Gil Cisneros, who'd been in the military, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post over this Ukraine call, the call to the president of Ukraine, asking him to help. I'd like a favor, though, that phone call. Did you talk with her about that strategy around impeachment, and how did she approach it?
Yeah, we talked about impeachment quite a bit. A year ago, it seemed like that was going to be the biggest scandal of the entire, Trump-Pelosi relationship. Those were different times. No spoilers, but my book actually ends with impeachment because it is the sort of climactic clash of these two political characters and all of the forces and opposing values that they represent. But she had lived through, not counting Nixon, she'd lived through two other impeachment drives. There was the impeachment of Bill Clinton, which her word for it is she believed it was a joke. She thought that the Republicans simply never saw Clinton as a legitimate president because they believed he was low class, and that while his behavior was regrettable, he did not deserve to be impeached for it. Then, when she became Speaker for the first time in 2007, there was a drive to impeach George W. Bush over the Iraq War, and it might not have been quite the fever pitch that the impeachment drive was in 2018, but there were Code Pink protesters camped out in Nancy Pelosi's lawn in San Francisco for weeks. Cindy Sheehan went and ran against her in that congressional primary because all these liberals were so mad that Nancy Pelosi had taken impeachment of George W. Bush off the table. So when it came to Trump, I think those two experiences really informed her perspective of, she saw impeachment as a really extreme, the sort of ultimate remedy available to Congress, and she didn't want to push that button unless she felt that it was really warranted. And politically, she thought it was a loser, right? That it sort of conflicted with that whole political strategy of trying to advance a substantive agenda. And, if there's anything that you take away from my book about Nancy Pelosi, it's that she cares more than anything about results. And so I think she viewed impeachment as sort of, symbolic but pointless, because what would it achieve? She did not believe that the Republicans in the Senate were ever going to actually remove Trump from office. So she viewed it as almost a pointless gesture. Now she obviously did eventually go through with it after keeping the brakes on for months and months. in part because her caucus had moved to that position, and in part because she did feel that it was necessary to do on the merits, that Trump's conduct was so egregious that if they didn't do this, they would be amiss. But she stage managed the impeachment very tightly. She kept it very limited to the Ukraine matter, and rebuffed the many Democrats who wanted to broaden it to various other areas of Trump's alleged misconduct. And she saw to it that it was a very that it was a tight and short and clean process. And now that it's in the rear view, I think a lot of people would say that she was sort of proved right. It didn't accomplish anything except maybe put an asterisk next to Trump's name in the rule books, right? That that's what she'll tell you if you ask her what was the point of all this. Well, he's been impeached and no one can take that away. But other than that, it didn't feed a healthy child. It didn't get somebody a raise. It didn't give anybody health care. And so the tangible results of improving people's lives, that is what she says she will tell you she is always focused on. And impeachment just sort of didn't play into that.
Do you want to take another question or two from the queue?
Yeah, well, what I was going to say, there was a question here from Sharon Kaufman who writes, do you think she will really step down as speaker in 2 years? I hope not, she writes. That was part of the deal, I think, right, Molly, with the people that want to get rid of her as speaker, that she agreed to step down after 2022. What do you think? Did you talk with her about that at all?
I have spoken with her about it. She gets quite prickly if you ever bring up the prospect of her retirement. She will accuse you of ageism and sexism and, oh, well, why don't you go ask Mitch McConnell? He's almost my age. And people do ask Mitch McConnell. But she also will say, well, these other politicians my age, they've got 20 years more experience than I do because I didn't run for office until my kids were grown. So I think she somehow believes that you're supposed to deduct 20 years from her age because she got started late, which is not how chronological age actually works, but that's her argument. I think Nancy Pelosi will retire when she wants to retire, and she's not going to tell anyone ahead of time. I would not be stunned if she retires after this election, but I also would not be surprised if she stays. She has said to me and others that she was thinking about hanging it up after 2016 if Hillary had won the election, and that part of the reason that she stayed was because without her there wouldn't be a woman in the room when those negotiations are happening. And I do think that that's something that matters to her. Now, and I think it's also a bit of a rationalization for the fact that she believed that a former staffer of hers once described her motivations in a way that's always stuck with me as the sort of Nancy Pelosi Rosetta Stone. And he said, everything that she does comes from this combination of obligation and entitlement. And I don't mean entitlement negatively, you could just say confidence, I suppose, but she looks at a particular situation and says, well, somebody's got to do this. And then she looks around and says, well, I'm the best person to do it. And so she has stayed on multiple occasions when a lot of people expected her to leave, because she looked around and didn't see someone else who she thought could do this important job as well as she believed she was capable of doing it. Now,
do you have any sense of who she thinks would be that person now? I mean, there's talk about Hakeem Jeffries, for example.
And she has not anointed a successor or really even groomed one. And this is another source of criticism. And I think it's obvious why she hasn't. Anybody that she sort of promoted would then become a threat to her, right? But she does have favorites. The late lamented Katie Hill was someone that she was mentoring and clearly liked very much. She obviously has great affection for Adam Schiff. Hakeem Jeffries, another one of her favorites. Catherine Clark from Massachusetts. But the fact that it's kind of a unique situation in the Democratic caucus that she and her two deputies are all about 80 years old. So she and Steny Hoyer and Jim Clyburn, none of them are a potential long-term successor because they're all her age too. And at least Clyburn thinks that they'll probably all go at the same time. But she believes that when she wanted to be in leadership and later speaker, nobody groomed her for that position. nobody plucked her out of the ranks and made her teacher's pet and said, here's what you have to do to get the votes. She, in fact, had to fight the, male establishment of the House Democrats and run against the sort of favored candidate of the establishment. And so when people ask her about passing the baton, she says, well, everybody's got a baton in their handbag and it's up to them to pull it out. She believes on a very deep level that power is not something that is handed to you. It's something that you take. And she believes that whoever is best for that position in the future is the person who's going to fight for it and win it. And that is the way that they will prove that they deserve that job, much as she did. Now, I did ask her at one point, why haven't you groomed a successor? Isn't it irresponsible to not have any, transition plan once you leave? And she said, oh, well, I was grooming a successor. It was Chris Van Hollen, and then he left me and ran for Senate. And former Congressman Chris Van Hollen now has a nice, safe seat in the Senate from Maryland. But part of the reason that he left the House to run for Senate was that Nancy Pelosi wasn't giving any indication of when she might move on and let that spot open up. So it has been quite a source of angst for ambitious junior members of the House Democratic Caucus that the leadership has been frozen in place for now more than 15 years, and it's very difficult. It's impossible to advance to those top levels.
Jane, do you want to wrap it up? Or I could ask one more question.
I was going to say maybe just time for one more question.
Well, maybe I'll play off of something that Hannah Meyer wrote. She asks, how do you think the shift in the conversation around gender and increased representation of women in politics has affected how the media reflects Pelosi? And I just wanted to ask you, Molly, in the book, you say that when you, I think it was at some point, I don't remember exactly when, but her staff was complaining to you that she had never been on the cover of Time or Newsweek or US News and World Report, whereas all these men, Gingrich and Ryan, had all been on the cover and she hadn't been. And you write that struck you as petty and conspiratorial, which surprised me that you felt that way. Maybe it's more for me now, hindsight, you can see why she felt that way, that she deserved to be on the cover of those magazines. But what was it about that at the time that made you feel that was a petty concern?
Oh, well, I think anybody in the news business understands that the cover of Time magazine is not an award for merit. It's a weekly expression of what we think is in the center of the news. And so by sheer coincidence, whoever happens to be on top of the news in a particular week is who is likely to be on the cover. And I was not assigned a cover profile of Nancy Pelosi because we suddenly looked back and said, oh, she's earned it, and it's been an oversight that we haven't given it to her before. It was the fact that she was in the center of the news. She was the House Minority Leader at a time when Democrats were seeking to take back the House in the first national elections of the Trump era. And she was the centerpiece of both the Democrats' campaign in terms of fundraising and strategy, and the Republicans' campaign, in that she basically was their entire campaign message. They had basically come out and said, well, our campaign strategy consists of putting Nancy Pelosi's face in another, 100,000 attack ads. So that's what I meant by that, was just the detecting of some larger purposeful scheme in the sort of day-to-day hurly-burly of news coverage. That's what I meant. That's what I was referring to as conspiratorial. There was no grand plan to deny Nancy Pelosi the cover. Now, does everybody have blind spots? Does it matter that, the bosses of Time magazine since time immemorial have been, white men of a certain social class who have a certain perspective on what readers are interested in and what doesn't sell magazines? Absolutely. But in terms of there being an actual, it's a combination of all of those factors, I think, that adds up to whether somebody gets put on the cover or not.
And then just to Hannah's point, last question, do you feel like this, it's interesting to watch how women's groups have basically put the media on notice about their coverage of Kamala Harris. And they're kind of watching to make sure that there's not this, bias seeping into the coverage. Do you think that has something to do with the way the media is perceiving or covering Nancy Pelosi now?
Yeah, so I do think that there's been a major reversal in Nancy Pelosi's public image. And that's sort of from the ground up, right? That it comes from this grassroots mobilization of women in politics. that has sort of spawned this new recognition. You know, a lot of the characteristics that are now celebrated in Nancy Pelosi, her toughness and her confrontational nature, her being willing to get in people's faces and being a very hard negotiator. Those were not necessarily seen as attractive qualities in a woman until quite recently. So I think the change, I write a lot in the book about shifts in cultural perception around women and women's capabilities, and how I think that has played a major role in shaping the way Nancy Pelosi is perceived and the way that, and inevitably, the way that she's described in the media. Now, I have a lot of complicated feelings about this whole, you know, putting the media on notice things. And one of the things I write about in the book is that I don't think it's sexist, for example, to describe how women politicians look, what they wear, how they manage, how they seek to shape the perceptions of them. And this is something that we get yelled at for all the time. But in general, yes, writing this book was really meaningful to me because because I was able to sort of close the loop on so many subjects that I have spent so many years thinking about, including the ways that women are perceived in politics and the ways that perception drives the whole political process, right? Elections are a literal popularity contest. And so what we view as a popular perception, who we view as polarizing or as negative or whatever else, plays a huge role in the ways that voters make decisions and the ways that politicians comport themselves. So it's a really rich subject, and it's a major component of the book.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for writing it and for sharing it with us. And I'll hand it off to Jane, but I really recommend it. It's full of great anecdotes and insights and stories, and go out and get it.
Thank you, Scott. I was going to say that myself. You beat me to it.
Say it again.
I want to thank Scott Shafer of KQED and Molly Ball of Time Magazine so much for this conversation tonight. It was breathtaking. I mean, I can't believe an hour and 15 went by so quickly. Again, if you get an email asking you to fill out a survey for Litquake, please do. And please donate if you feel so inclined. And thank you guys very much. We have another week and a half of programming to go. So check litquake.org for more fantastic events coming your way. And have a good evening. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Vote. Vote.
Thank you.